Most people might have heard me, but not everybody. It's someone, no, I don't have enough time for it. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, now we're past the time of 9, and I have so many things to talk to you about. I'm not sure I'm going to have time with the time I have. But then the things that we're dealing with are important. In the world of men, maybe not so much. But for us, they're vitally important because they deal with the one thing that matters most to us, and that is our eternal salvation. And at the same time, it's also a part of our internal salvation. Because if we know what we are to do, then we can do what we are to know. That sounds so simplistic, even when I say it out loud, but I still think that it matters incredibly well. When you look at the scriptures that we're dealing with in the book of Leviticus, there are a lot of things here that people get hung up on. They get hung up on the sacrifices and the things that they did in those days. But we need to understand, I'm going to repeat it again, I probably will do it several more times before I'm done with, is that this people just left Egypt. They hardly know anything about God. It's like, unfortunately, a large part of our nation today. Some may claim about a knowledge of God, but not so much, I don't think. The other thing about these people you need to understand is that they had been surrounded by idolatry for the most part. And these big, massive statues that the Egyptians worshipped in their places of worship, and their very strong, politically as well, priesthoods that controlled so many things in their day and their time. Plus, the Egyptians had their particular traditions which they followed. So what you see is that this is something they have been raised around. Of course, they were kind of a little bit isolated in their land of Goshen, but at the same time, they were, over a period of time, systematically employed and then enslaved to do things for Egypt. And then suddenly this fellow Moses shows up and says, you're free. Take everything you got and leave. Don't leave nothing behind. Take all you can grab. Which is basically what they did. When you look at the things they used to make the golden calf a few months later, where do you think all that stuff came from? It came from Egypt. They took it. They used it. I'm sure that was one of the reasons why Pharaoh was a little hot, because they took a lot of stuff when they left. But then you might say they were getting paid by back pay. The point is that these people, I would imagine a lot of them, had very little information or knowledge of God. I'm sure they knew about their people. We know Moses was trained by his mother by some things that she was able to impart to him, enough to get him to understand that he was a part of something more than just the Egyptian group of people. But Moses, above all those people, would have been influenced by the rulers of Egypt and all their things that they did in their worship of false gods. And yet, this group of people who moved across that dry land, across that sea, now we're finding out that there was a whole lot more involved to than just being God's chosen. It's one thing to be told you something. It's another thing when you find out you have to act upon it. And this is what we're looking at, the book of Leviticus. Now, as I was talking with you last week, we had to understand that as God was inviting these people into a covenant relationship, I'm sure many of them didn't even understand the idea of covenant. I'm sure they knew that it's one thing to make a contract with somebody. It's another thing to understand how you are now bound by something you did not know. As these things are being done, they are finding out there's more involved. And I was trying to get to that point where I was talking last week. Okay, we talked about Moses and others were on the mountain receiving the law, and the people rose up to play in Exodus 32 and sinned and just about ended everything. So this is what the book of Leviticus is for. There are many laws being told to the people beginning from verse 32 and following after their sin is parted. But they are getting a lot of law, especially from chapter 20 and following. But when these laws are brought up and they're being trained in them, they're discovering some things here. When you open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Leviticus, the first chapter. I told you that the book of Leviticus is divided up in about 6 parts. The first part is dealing with the sacrifices, but you need to understand that you might call it's a ritual. A ritual is something that you follow on a progressive nature. Some people have morning rituals where they get up, they brush their teeth, comb their hair, put their contacts in, and then take their medicine, they drink a cup of coffee, head out the door to work. You could call that a ritual. It's something you practice over and over again. Well, these people needed also the rituals because they now had to be trained in a way to please God. We talked about the how many thousands of people there were here. And now they're all going to have to be trained on how to serve God. They're the representatives of 12 brothers, and there are a bunch of them. I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000. So they now have to learn these rituals. And in the book of Leviticus, there are 2 sections on rituals. The first section is located chapter 1 through 7. These deal with sacrifices. The second set of rituals begins in Luke 23 and goes to chapter 25. These are different kinds of rituals. These are rituals to remember. And so there are a set of series of feasts that the Gentiles would follow, that the Hebrews would follow to train themselves to remember. One thing we need to understand here is God is trying to get them to remember. You know, Peter talked about remembering in the book of Peter, and he said something, I bring to you remembrance. And he will say that 3 times. I'm trying to help you to remember. There's a big difference between these people here and us today, except for one part. We need to learn how to remember. Not just anything, not like remembering your password to get into your account, but to remember what it means to be apart with God. You know, we have been set aside. They were set aside. They were trained. We should be training ourselves. Because if we don't train ourselves, then we don't have the ability to help someone else to be trained. And this is something that is a very important part of Christianity, is teaching someone so that they too can be saved. Now, when you look at these rituals, especially in chapter 1 through 7, that there are two of these sacrifices were a way of saying thanks to God. And the others were a way of saying, I'm sorry. That's basically what it boils down to. Thanks, and I'm sorry. Forgive me. The thing about the law is that while it gave these people atonement, it didn't give them freedom from sin. Now, you know, in the book of Hebrews, it talks about, in chapter 8, I believe, he talks about the fact that the high priest had to continually go and offer sacrifice for his sins. He had to do that so that he could deal with the sins of the people. So they were constantly, every time they would come forward to offer a sacrifice, they were constantly remembering that we are sinful. What is sinful? The Greek word calls it hamartia, which means, you know, off the path. There's a way to go, but you're over here. I talked about that the other day. Talked to some fellows about the thing about sin and Satan is he gets you to depart the path. Sometimes he doesn't need just a big, like a right-hand turn. You're going north and now the car is going west. You know, that's pretty obvious. But suppose he diverts your path by just a little bit, say just a little bit north and west. Not too far apart, not too hard to keep you or get your attention, but just a little bit. Over a period of time, that little bit increases. Pretty soon, you're way over here headed west, and you're out of where you were supposed to be. Satan is not done. The Bible tells us in 1 Peter 5:8 that he's like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Satan is not done. We need to understand that and accept it. And that if we're not careful, if we don't pay attention to our own selves, we will find ourselves like the prey that's caught at the water hole, not paying attention, drug off into the bush and devoured. Just to make a point here, in Leviticus 18, in verse 4 and 5, God makes a statement. You are to perform my judgments and keep my statutes, to live in accord with them. I am the Lord your God. So you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, by which a man may live if he does them. I am the Lord. This is something that God's trying to help these people understand. Oh. Give me a second. These people are trying to learn about God. And God is saying, this is what you learn and how you learn. And if you learn this, you can live. A man may live if he does them. Now, what's the difference between that statement and today? What words do we live by? Do we live by the words from the law? Not directly. We live by the words that the apostles, who were God's messengers, by Jesus' appointment to teach us these things. Now, you've heard that particular little appointment, but turn over to the book of Galatians. Let's go to the 3rd chapter. We'll look at about verse 10. We already understand that the Galatians were having problems. with the law. They were a group of people that the scriptures would basically call the Judaizing teachers. Now, these people were trying to get Christians to be a Christian and a Jew at the same time. They wanted them to follow the law. Well, in this book of Galatians, Paul grabs hold of those people and says, hey, listen to me. He said, I marvel in chapter 1 that you are so soon taken away from the path. In this chapter, in a previous verse, he says, oh, you foolish Galatians. Now, I'll read that little part. Verse 1, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed and crucified? This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by hearing with faith? The words of God are important. We need to listen to them. But they also have their time and their meaning. Now, we can look at what we just read in Leviticus 18 and said, God said, a man can live if he listens to my word. And here, these people are not listening. What they're not listening to is what God said in Leviticus 18, because the law changed. We know the law was nailed on the cross with Christ. We're told that in Colossians 2. The law was nailed to the cross. Paul would call the law those things which were laws of death written and engraven on stones. That kind of eyesight. We know he's talking about the commandments that were written by God upon those stones that Moses would later destroy. They were rewritten by Moses, but they were engraven on stones. God promised in Jeremiah 33 that I will write my laws on the fleshly tablets of their heart. That same thing that same quote from Jeremiah 33 is quoted in the book of Hebrews. So the thing that he said in Leviticus is very important. If you follow my law, you will live. If we follow the law of Christ, we will live. But in Galatians 3 and verse 10, he says, for as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to perform them. Now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident that righteous men shall live by faith. In Galatians 5:4, he said, if you have not followed the law of grace, but you have tried to follow the law of Moses, you have fallen from grace. The early Christians in the first century, the Jewish Christians, would be having a hard time understanding that the law no longer was in force. In this same book of Galatians, Paul is trying to point out to them that the law had a point, and it was a tutor so that men would learn what the law was, what it meant, what sin was, how to obey God. But now, something has changed, and that is Jesus. So if you go back to the book of Leviticus, go back to the first chapter, we get into the things that were important to those people. As I said earlier, they're rituals. They're something they practiced on a regular basis. It's something they had to understand because it's like us. We need to understand the law of Christ. We need to know it. It's like I've asked my kids before, and I believe I said something to y'all about it last week. If we know this, we should already know it. Many of us in here have been Christians for many years. Some not. But the point is that we need to know these things. And the thing that we have discovered in the Old Testament, if you didn't know the law and you didn't know what you were doing, you could die. We talked about the gentleman who his name was Uzzah. He was trying to keep the ark from falling over, and he touched it. And you remember? He died. Because that's not something he was supposed to do. There are other recorded things in the Old Testament that talk about people who didn't do what God said, and they died. There's some in Leviticus, the 10th chapter. And they were sons of Aaron. They did something that God said, don't do, and they died. They died physically. Brethren, the death that we're afraid of is not a physical death, it's eternal death. Death in the lake of fire, where the worm dieth not. This is something that we need to be concerned with. But to understand what we have now, you need to understand what they had then. Again, Galatians says the law was a tutor. Well, let's look at the tutor. Verse 1, chapter 1 of Leviticus. Then the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the sons of Israel. Say to them, when any man of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of animals of the herd or the flock. So I say again, where'd the animals come from? From Egypt, the gold, everything. These things, all these people brought all this with them. And so, here's the thing. The word is called offering. I believe we defined it the other day. If I didn't, I'm going to remind you. There was a group of Pharisees in the New Testament that would, if they were trying to hide their wealth from their parents, they would call it korban. That means it was for God. So they had what they wanted. They just said it. I don't think they did it. And Jesus called them out on it. But that word, korban, is the same word used here. When a man brings an offering to the Lord, korban. So they're bringing, and it is an offering that's been designated to the Lord. But now there were specifications for these offerings, the korban. Look, verse 3. If his offering is a burnt offering. Burnt offerings were different from other sacrifices. Everything was burnt on the altar. But that altar was particular and special. The first thing is, the fire was never allowed to go out on the altar because God was the first one who ever lit it. Therefore, that fire was kept burning. When they went from one place to another in their wanderings, they would gather up hot coals from that fire and they would keep it burning until they stopped and relit a new sacrificial fire. This was something they did. I don't think it was easy. No way. This is why the young men and themselves got in trouble in Leviticus 10, because this fire was special. And it's important to understand that God thought it was special. So when any of you bring your offering of livestock, and if it is to be burnt, here are the specifications. He shall bring it, cattle or sheep, doesn't make too much difference. It has to be a male. And it has to be without defect. Why do you suppose it had to be without defect? And why do you suppose it had to be a male? Have you ever thought about that? It was a male because when God created all things, he created the man first. The fact that the man was first is not a disrespect or womanhood, unlike some people teach. It's the fact that God made man first. And that's important. To God, may not mean anything to us, but it should. There's a reason God had a reason for everything he does and specifies. So it had to be a male for the sacrifice. Secondarily, it had to be the best of the flock. What does that mean? It means if the guy was going to, when a fella goes to the auction barn, he didn't bring a crippled calf. That doesn't work. It won't ever be bought. You didn't bring that crippled calf to God either. As a matter of fact, in the book of Malachi, that same statement is brought. He said, well, will you mock God? Why? Because he said those people were bringing their not quite right cattle. Maybe he had a crossed hide. Maybe he had two heads. Maybe he had a broken leg. Or the hide was scarred. You name it. I don't know. But they were bringing the thing that didn't count to God. And Malachi would make the statement, take that same animal offering to the governor and see what happens to you. That's right. It would have been rejected. But if people couldn't bring something like that to God, because what were they bringing the sacrifice for? Forgiveness. The sacrifice was brought because the person had a problem with God. Do you want to be crosswise with God? The New Testament tells us that our God is a God of fire. Do you want to be crosswise with God? These people didn't want to be. They'd already seen several examples of what happened when you disobeyed God. They saw some very visceral examples. You can go through and name them, all through the New, sometimes through the New, but basically through the Old Testament. If you didn't do what God asked, you could die. Matter of fact, one of the statements in the book of Leviticus, you do this lest you die. Now, they died physically. And I'm sure it was also a spiritual death as well. If we sin and we don't do what God has asked us, we die, but we die spiritually. And that equals the same thing in all eventualities. Remember when Adam and Eve sinned, God told them, don't eat of the tree in the midst of the garden, lest you die. And Satan tempted them, saying, you're not going to die. They did. It wasn't the kind of death that they assumed. And Satan may have known what kind of death they were going to get, because I'm sure he was anticipating some companionship. But the point is they did die spiritually. And so from the time of Adam to the day that we live now, our whole point is to clean away the things that separate us from God. In Isaiah 59, verse 1 and 2, it tells us it's sin. So if we clean away from these things, then we can again be with God. That is the goal, or should be the goal, of every man, woman, and child that lives upon the earth today. Many of them are like those Israelites. They have no clue what's happening. And that, brethren, is our responsibility. When you look at that banner over the door when you leave the church today, what does it say? We are now entering the fields. And the fields are white unto harvest. Jesus said that, and he said that many years ago, but they're still true. So The sacrifice was to give them forgiveness for their sins. So that's why it was important. It had to be free from fault. Because we are full of fault, and that was supposed to remove our sin. We know that the Scriptures tells us that Jesus was without fault. He had no defects. And because of that, he was the perfect sacrifice. And just like that, when these men brought their sacrifices to God, it too had to be without fault, free from defect, complete, whole, the best of the best. And if you brought anything less, you were going to have problems. If his offering is burnt offering from the herd, beginning in verse 3, he shall offer it, a male without defect. He shall offer it at the doorway of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. If it wasn't right, it wasn't accepted. He had to go back. Verse 4, he shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him, to make atonement on his behalf. So this man is coming up with his problems. He has a fault with God, and this is his way of getting atonement. Now, I want us to understand here that in the Old Testament, the blood of many animals was shed. Many. But the shedding of that blood for those animals could not take away sin. The atonement put God's wrath in abeyance. It's not gone, it's obeyed. It's behind, it's stored away. Because the blood and bulls of goat could not take away sin. You can read about that in the book of Hebrews. The blood and bulls of goats. It didn't remove sin because their sins were constantly brought again before them. All the time from Moses to the time of Christ. It was only after Christ was crucified that forgiveness was possible. You have to understand what they had so you can understand what we have. And they're just learning. And now, brethren, we ought to know. This is important for you to know. Let's keep reading. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, that it may be accepted for him, to make atonement on his behalf. In verse 5, he shall slay the young bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall offer up the blood and sprinkle the blood around on the altar, that is, in the doorway of the tent of meeting. Now, see, to us in our day, this probably sounds pretty gross. And I guess I would think it was pretty gross. I never slaughtered any animals, deers, pigs, or otherwise. I've heard it. Many years ago, I was in Turkey, Texas, at a family reunion, and these fellows brought in a pig to cook. And they slaughtered him. I have never heard such a thing in my life. And I'll tell you now, I still remember the squeals of that pig. And these men did somewhat the same thing. They caught the blood because they were going to use it for something. I don't want to know. I didn't ask. But they had a special pail they had right up underneath when they cut that animal's throat and he started bleeding out. It was sickening. It was to me. And the sound that animal made as he gave up his life was terrible. I bet that scream was heard from one end of the town to another. I have not forgotten it. But don't you see what was done to those animals is the pain that God sees when we sin. The agony that they suffer is in our place. So when they sacrifice these animals, and as hard as it's for me to see it done, I can imagine our sin before God is just as hard. This was the one way that God found that he could stand us, for lack of a better idea, for the lack of better words, that he could abide by our presence because of our sins. Remember, sin separates man from God. It's ugly. And every time these people sacrifice an animal, they should have been reminded that sin is ugly. Now, so they slay the animal, the priest catch the blood, and they offer up the blood and sprinkle the blood around the altar that is at the door of the tent way of meeting. This is work, folks. I have seen some animals butchered. I had not done it myself, but I've seen it. It's work. You have to make sure you have to have a sharp knife, because after the bull is slain, then he shall skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. What does that mean? If you've ever done any deer hunting, what these people are doing is after they lay the animal down, they make the right cuts and they pull the skin off the animal. But the skin is still there, and they leave the piece of the animal on the skin, and they commence to cutting up the sacrifice in the way that it needs to be divided. There are certain things they had to do. They had to pay attention to this. He skins the offering, and then he cuts it into pieces. Verse 7, the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put the fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. This is why Saul got in so much trouble. He offered sacrifice, and it wasn't supposed to. And because he did it incorrectly and he didn't do what he was told, Saul found himself rejected as being king over Israel. So there are things that had to be done by different people. Why? Because God said, do it this way. We don't have to understand it. There's a lot of things that we have in the scriptures that tell us to do certain things we may not understand. We can if we study. But the point is that God said it. He directed them to do these things. And this is what they did. So the priest had to set up the fire. They put more wood on the fire. Why would you think they would put more wood on the fire? You had to make the fire hotter. If you ever had a fireplace, and I have, and you got a fire going there and the wood burns down real slow, if you throw a bunch more wood on that thing, what happens? The fire kind of goes out because you've more or less smothered it. So now the fire's got to rebuild back up. And this is what they're doing. They've already burned other sacrifices, so now they're fixing to burn another. So more wood goes on the fire. Where did they get the wood? I don't know. They were in the desert. But somehow they found it, and they found what was needed, and they used it. Probably God provided for them to find, as he provided everything else. So the sons of Aaron put fire on the altar and arrange wood in the fire, and then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head, and the soot over the fire which is on the fire that is on the altar. Do any of you know what soot is? It actually refers to the fat that is on the kidneys and around the liver. I looked this up the other night and discovered that is highly desirable as food. Matter of fact, you can go to stores and find it in cans. It's not cheap particularly, but it's considered a good thing to eat. So this is another something that I didn't know, and maybe these people didn't know, but it was a good part of the meat to eat. But on the sacrifices, the good part was given to God. It was burned on the fire. Its entrails, however, and its legs shall he wash with water. And the priest shall offer up and smoke all of it on the altar for a burnt offering, an offering by the fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. Now, this is the whole point, that last verse. Have any of you ever burned your food on the stove? It just takes once to get you to understand, not to forget that. My wife's not here yet, so I can tell you one time she put some peas on the stove and forgot about them, doing something else. Water boiled out, and the peas burned. I mean, critically burned. As soon as I walked in the house, I knew it. Oh, they stunk. Matter of fact, I couldn't even clean that pan up. I threw the whole pan away. I tried. Terrible. And the smell lingered for days. Finally went away. But here's the point of that. I burnt food myself. So don't go tell her. Don't y'all go tell her I'm telling on her. That was done many years ago. We were both young. But I burned food myself. It don't smell good. Yet, we're told here that what they did here was a sweet aroma to God. It was hard for us. It'd be hard for us to stand, but not for God. Why? I hope you're thinking about it. This whole class I'm trying to do is get you to think about what we do versus what they did and why it's important. Why was it a sweet aroma? Because they were doing what he said. That's the point. Everything that's here we're talking about is because they did what God told them to do. And the resulting completion of this particular act was pleasing to God. You have the same terminology used in the New Testament when we do things that God expects of us. And I've got it written down right here, but I'm going to have to hunt for it in all my notes. That might take me a little bit, but I'll make sure I find that and that we know about it. But when we do what God has asked us to do, he gets the same sweet aroma. So that's what's used in the New Testament. It still holds out for us. It's here somewhere. I'll find it. So after they do all these things and the animal is burnt, then they receive the gift of atonement. Then in verse 10 he says, but the offering is from the flock of the sheep or the goats for a burnt offering. He shall offer it. Now here's again specifications. A male without defect. He shall slay it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord. So they had a place where things were done. And Aaron's son, the priest, shall sprinkle the blood around upon the altar, same thing like the other one. Then he shall cut it into pieces with its head and its soot, and the priest shall arrange them on the wood on the fire on the altar. The entrails, however, and the legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall offer it all, and offer it up in smoke on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering by fire of a soothing aroma to the Lord. Now, what you may not understand what's going on here is that we're also dealing with the ability, financial ability. How much would a cow cost over a sheep or a goat? The expense is evidently greater. Why? Because, well, a cattle by itself would produce more meat than the sheep or goat. Now, sheep or goat has some other issues, has some other things. We know the skin for them can be used for something, as the skin for the sacrifice of the animal can be used for something. But the value is relative. One costs more than the other. So the goat evidently would cost less, or the sheep would cost less, and they would offer the sacrifice. But, verse 14, if his offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall bring his offering from the turtle doves or from young pigeons. If you weren't rich or you were poor and this was all you had to offer, God would give you this. But now, if you're holding a whole bunch of cattle and you would bring in a bird for offering, I would think you would be in trouble. For the simple fact is, you were to bring your best. And that still applies to us today. When we worship God, we are to bring our best. We are not to be thinking about the game or Father's Day dinner or the golf we're going to play next week or even the job we got to do tomorrow, the yard we got to mow. You are to bring your best to God now. When you worship, when we take the Lord's Supper later this morning, the focus is the same. When you bring your offering before God, what do you bring in your offering this morning? What? It's something that you need to think about. What is your offering this morning? I used to have a boss. He would, every time I would do something or say something to him, he said, "Yeah, that's fine, but what are you going to do for me now?" I thought, he just used to flabbergast me because I did all this work and I did this and it's working and it's happy. And then he looked at me and said, "Well, what are you going to do for me now?" But here I am now, many years later, and I understand. I've done this, but more is expected. Does that sound unreasonable? At the time, I thought so. But applied to God and the things that we're doing, it is not. When you come to worship God today, what are you doing for Him now? What value do we bring to the table? When we worship God in the Lord's Supper, when we take the little bread and the fruit of the vine, where's your mind? What do we have to offer God? That's what God wants. What do you have to offer? Obedience? Sacrifice? Belief? Teaching? These things should be a part of your consideration in your worship. What you will find in the book of Galatians in that 3rd chapter we didn't get to because I'm running out of time, is that he talks about the works of the law. The law was a law of works. Yet we now work by faith, is what Paul would tell them in Galatians. The works of the law were works. Why? To get atonement. Why? To stave off their sins. Why? Because they wanted to be well-pleasing before God. What do we do now? That's something you have to figure out. You can't not do nothing. You can't sit here with your mind on neutral, not thinking about the things that you need to be thinking about. And I can't point my finger with that three pointing back at me. I'm not saying this because I am perfect or without fault. Ask Linda and she'll tell you I'm not. But brethren, this is all part and parcel with approaching God and serving. They had to learn it the hard way through hard, dirty work. Christ has done a lot of our dirty work now. He died on that cross. So all this applies to us today. Thank you for your time, and we'll continue this next week again.